Oh, all right.
That was loud. Okay. So, quick background story. No, wait. Or not.
I got it working. I'm gonna.
Well, I have an audience of one. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me after.
Did I say why he's not here?
Did you say why? Who's not here?
No, did Isaac say why he's not here?
He's in California.
Oh, he's in California.
Yeah, there's a work thing.
I just wanted to make sure I won't run out of juice because
Uh-huh.
the recording is very expensive.
I mean, there's also a charger in front of you.
This one needs lots of words.
This is charging, yes? Charging, yes. Okay. So yeah, quick background story. So I do some consulting work through Platonic Systems, the company Isaac owns. And they recently were approached by a new startup client. Anyway, so they entered into some conversation, some requirement negotiation. And the result of that was basically that they want to build a product that starts with the exact same tool chain that I'm using for my own startup. So Isaac came to me and said, hey, would you mind taking your code, just removing everything that's specific to your startup, and then we have a skeleton that we can use. So I did that for him, and they're going to be using that now. Within a week, I was talking to another friend of mine who's trying to build his own startup but doesn't know anything about tech. So he got an intern backend engineer to build a backend, and I took a look at it, and it was absolutely horrid. So I was talking to him about it, and it turns out that I can take the same skeleton and get it all the way up to the feature set that he has in like 2 days by just copy pasting a bunch of the front end stuff and then adjusting it slightly so it fits into the skeleton. And because these two things happened like within a week from each other, I was like, at least there seems to be something happening here. So I decided, you know what, the skeleton is quite a good idea. So I thought maybe I should talk about that. So basically, I want to talk about 3 things. One, why is it useful to have like kind of a template for what a new project looks like, a greenfield project or a startup or something like this. The second is why it's more useful than you might think. And then I just want to go through a few things that I've done here that might be of interest to Haskell people. So yeah, first of all, something that I've noticed is that in requirement negotiation about a new project, the tool chain that I'm proposing always keeps converging to the same thing. Obviously, I'm somewhat biased because I'm a Haskell engineer, so I like Haskell. So everything I do uses Haskell and Nix, unless there's a very good reason not to. But also things like a lot of projects need some kind of payment integration. Every startup should use Stripe, in my opinion. Most projects need some kind of authentication. I think all of them should use Auth0 in the beginning. Afterwards, you can start thinking about other solutions, but at least in the beginning. And same thing with a bunch of other things. I would always use SQLite. I would always I always need database backups. There's just a bunch of things that you always need, so it makes sense to kind of take all of that apart and set up a clear skeleton. The reason I think this is more useful than most people might assume is because when you start a new project, there's always a temptation to go build features rather than build your skeleton first and then build in features. And so if I ask you, hey, here's a new idea, I want you to build this, you have 2 months. You're going to spend your first week not just building a skeleton and then adding things, adding your features. You're just going to start building features. And so most of the companies that I've been involved in started building things and go, you know what, I know I should kind of set up CI, but I don't have any tests yet anyway, so it doesn't matter. And then they wait 2 months to go set up CI. And once they set up CI, now it turns out everything is fucked. And so everything gets a bit more complicated. Same thing with deployment, right? Like you build a thing and after 6 months you go, maybe I should deploy this. And then you try to deploy it and it turns out you've just set up a bunch of things to not be easy to deploy. And so there's a bunch of things related to that. Which gives a big advantage to the idea of just setting up a skeleton rather than, for a specific project, because there is no temptation to build features. You don't know what features to build. So now you're actually solving the problem of, imagine I'm trying to build the best skeleton possible. What tool chain would I use? What kind of requirement negotiation should I be engaging in with new projects? But also things like, okay, I want Stripe integration. How do I test this? I want to make sure that I have my deployment, but what does my deployment look like? I need database backups. Think about that. You want testing. Well, if you're thinking about testing in the context of a startup, now you're thinking, I add this feature. How do I test my feature? And you're being very specific about that. Whereas with my skeleton, what I did was try and go, how can I go as broad as possible? Because I like having a broad testing portfolio. So my testing skeleton includes things like NixOS end-to-end tests. It includes Selenium tests. It includes integration tests like sit-test, ESOD integration tests. It includes an instance spec that I can show you later if you're interested, and a bunch of different things like that. So this is kind of why I think this might be more interesting than most people think. And then I just wanted to go through a few of the things that I've done here. I think one thing that is particularly interesting that is not very old yet is Nix. So there's a thing called Weeder, which was a project started 7 years ago, then got taken over by Oliver Charles. I think I wrote down somewhere who Neil Mitchell was the first person who was working on it, and then it got taken over by Oliver Charles, by Ollie as the maintainer. Sid recently Nixified that. So basically what Weeder does is it runs through all of your Haskell code and tries to figure out what code is never called, and it tells you about it. And now that Weeder has been Nixified, you can simply add that to your flake. I can just show you. Is this too big, too small? Fine. I mean, obviously you need to add this to your inputs, right? I don't really need to show much of that, I think. I'm also using overlays in order to pull this in. So I have, like, I define my packages with a set of overlays, including Weeder overlay over here. And then the only thing that I need to do is define these 4 lines. And now Weeder is included in my CI. So anytime I've written any code or made any refactor so that now some old code is no longer being used, I'm notified of it and I can go remove it. Obviously, if you're working on whip commits or something like this, you just ignore CI. But yeah, this has also been tried in a few companies that I'm aware of, where they came in and ran this and were able to throw away over 10% of the code base. So yeah, big advantage, a lot less code to maintain. So this is something that I quite liked. There's another thing, which is a library by Sid that I quite like, which is called optenvconf. Terrible name, but the idea of optenvconf is that any system that you set up probably needs some sort of configuration settings, right? So you have some settings, you define your settings, and now you want to be able to read that in through flags, through a config file, through environment variables. You want to link that up with the NixOS module that's connected to it. And for each one of those things, each parts of your settings, you need to go define what that looks like on all 4, and they somehow magically need to match. And then you need to make sure that you don't forget about all kinds of things, and it's not very clear, and your help function only shows you the flags, and there's all this mess. So there's this thing.
This for so long, I didn't realize it existed.
Right. It's not very old yet. But the idea is that you just define whatever settings you want, and all you need to do is define this Hask parser instance. You just say what the setting looks like. So you give it, a name. You say what, how to read it in, how to render it. A few pieces of information. There's a bunch of things that are just used as default, so it's quite easy to use. And the result of this is that you now have a thing. Maybe I should use 2 screens, actually. Is that big enough? So you have these settings, and then what you can do, so your help now looks like this. So you get all the help things that you want, a description of what the environment variable's name is, what kind of a thing it is. It creates a flag, it creates a config, everything. And the other cool thing about this is that there's actually commands that you can use here. Wait, I wrote down what the name of the command is. Render Nix options. And the result of this is a list, is your entire module. So this just writes a bunch of Nix code. What I did is put this Nix code here into options. And then I can call this, and my entire configuration is just defined, and it is automatically made sure that all of that is connected and all of that works. So there's no more confusion about these things. So that's one that I particularly liked. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that you would kind of like me to show you. Maybe one that is quite nice is...
Your mic is on, right? We are recording with audio, right? Double check.
My mic is on, yes.
Perfect.
Yes. So another one that I quite like is called instance spec. So obviously this is not very populated, as most of my tests are not very populated because it's a skeleton after all. But basically instance spec is using SID tests. And in SID tests, there's just a bunch of these things like JSON spec. What JSON spec does is it's a thing where you type annotated with a certain type, and then it's going to check all the JSON properties. So that automatically sets up a little test suite that's going to say for user UUID, if you generate a user UUID and then cast it to JSON, is that all fine? If you cast it to JSON and you go back from JSON, does that actually round trip? Like all of those kinds of things are automatically tested. There's also a version for persist spec, for persistence, for database interactions, and one for path piece spec. So I can put use that data type as an argument in my ESOT routes, in my URL. So those are some of the things that I've put in there.
Is the skeleton like on GitHub or anything? Or is it
It's
still-
right now, at least it's not public yet. I'm considering whether I want to make it public or not. So yeah, I have end-to-end tests, which also check all of my check my configuration and make sure that that all works. Have Selenium tests. One of the advantages of doing this skeleton thing is also that, like in the example of that I gave of the friend of mine approaching me and going, everything is horrid, I don't know what to do. Right? The problem that he had was he hired an intern, and the intern built a bunch of stuff. And if the intern needs to start from scratch, he doesn't know how to start from scratch. He doesn't know which database to pick. He doesn't know how to set up a database. He doesn't know how authentication should be working or any of these things. He doesn't know, hey, maybe I should use a web server because this project isn't making any money and isn't going to make any money too soon. So it's probably a bad idea to have a separated backend and frontend where the interaction is constantly failing. So providing them with a framework like this means that there's a lot less of an opportunity for the intern to make mistakes, right? Because now you can say all the basics are there. The testing portfolio is there. So you can just look at his PR and go, well, you didn't make use of that testing framework that I already set up for you. You can look at what those tests look like. He knows what reads to look at, et cetera, et cetera. So also for interns and juniors, this is a much easier approach. Yeah. Some basic tests for my authentication.
And so this level of population is like what your skeleton is in, right? This is like this isn't skeleton. This isn't the project at all.
No, this is not populated for the project at all. No, it's still like 2,000 lines or something like that. So yeah, so it basically has the basic version of everything, which I think like that's kind of my point in going through the exercise of what would the ideal skeleton look like, rather than how do I get started on this particular project. Like it forces you to think about things like a database backup. It's something before you go into production, everyone's going to need anyway. So
this is something that I definitely very strongly care about, and I feel like I struggle to get other people to care about it as well. So it's great to see you like caring about it.
But one of the advantages of it is that if you have a skeleton like this, and now you're having a conversation with the junior who goes, yeah, but because the argument that they have, really, the only argument they have against you saying set up a skeleton first is that they have to do it, and that takes time. They don't want to be thinking about database backups because there's nothing useful in the database. But they're never going to go, I set up the database backups for you, and having them go, oh, I don't care, I'll throw it away, right? Like the thing that they're objecting to is them putting time into it before they build features. But now that you have the skeleton, like as long as you keep this vaguely up to date, like every year you look at it and go, which things you want to swap out, like everything else, anyone could just use.
Right. So this is, and that's definitely one of the problems that I've run into with skeletons is like, you know, like I have well over 100 projects that all kind of rely on my skeletons, and but the skeletons evolve over time. And like, well, I want all of my existing projects to be updated, you know, just to stay in sync with that skeleton. It becomes hard as soon as you have like, you know, something there. And I mean, I do have like tools that are just like, oh, same template, and it will, you know, kind of like overwrite things, and I have to review and be like, oh yeah, just delete these changes. But yeah, I mean, I feel like that's, you know, the big problem with skeletons is that it is hard to keep them in sync. Once they've been established and you start modifying them for that particular project, it's hard to like.
But also, it doesn't need to be, right? Like the only goal for me in building the skeleton is so that if you start a new project and it is greenfield, that you can quickly get started and also get started right. That's the only goal. So all I want is that if I'm having a conversation with someone and they go, I want to build a new thing, and I go, well, is Haskell fine? Then yeah, you can just use this, right? And as long as this is up to date enough for me to say that, which means I should look at it at least once a year, it's fine. It doesn't really matter that in my own code base, there's a few things that I've added now, right? It's possible that I'm going to add things over the next 2 months and go, this is actually going to be very common. Like maybe everyone is going to need ChatGPT integrations over the next 6 months for some reason. And then I can just add my ChatGPT integration so they can look at it and they have a good example. But
solving technical problem, technical debt before the code.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like you want to be able to set everyone up for success, right? And I think, like for example, if I were to set something like this up, there's no need to test this with Selenium, right? But now if you have an intern and you tell him, hey, make a page that does X, Y, Z, and then you tell him now set up Selenium tests for it, it's horrible because he has no idea how to do this. And in this case, he just has all those examples. So he can look at this and go, well, which libraries did you use? The setup is already there. Now I can easily write something like, this auth form thing. And now everyone can know exactly what's going on. This is well documented. It's clear code, in my opinion.
But this has to be somewhat opinionated, right? Because you're deciding which technology stacks to go in, right?
Yes.
I'm using yes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're using kind of some version of Selenium as opposed to Puppeteer or something, right?
Sure. So there's some biases that are definitely in here and that are kind of unavoidable, right? Like I think that the most important bias that's completely unavoidable is Haskell and Nix, right? Like that's just, you like that stack or you don't. In my opinion, most of the other decisions are not really the result of a bias, but the result of my obsession with requirement negotiation. If you make no money, I don't think you should be using servants. Like, I don't think you should be building a React website that connects to a servant backend, because it's fancier than just using a web server. So if you just use ESO, that's genuinely simpler. And I think the step from that to like servant and JS talking to each other over an API, I think that should only be bridged once you're making money. So that's basically, I think, the two big decisions I make: Haskell and Nix, and Lean. Also, I'm not telling anyone that this is the framework that they should use. I mean, for one, it's private for now at least.
Yeah, you're going to throw half into it. And it's still like, oh, I'm not going to use this or this. It's like, well, the other stuff is still there.
Also, it gives you an example of how certain things work.
Yeah.
So at the very least, like if you say, hey, I like this idea, I also want the skeleton. I mean, I would highly advise you to build your own, because you're going to be adapting this all the time. So if you've never used ESO, it's like, this is a good starting point. If you don't like ESO, you can look at this and go, well, how did he integrate with Auth0? Oh, it turns out to be a thing, and then I can look at how that works. Sure. So at least for me personally, I think I'm going to keep sticking to this tool stack, just because to me this is the solution of the lean question. But yeah, definitely opinionated. As I think we all are. It is a Haskell meetup after all. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that you.
So what do you do for CI in your skeleton?
So I just use flakes, and then I have checks, and my checks are, a bunch of things that I find important. So I have my end-to-end tests. I have pre-commits. This is definitely an example of me being me having biases. But I like pre-commit hooks. They're easy to get rid of anyway. If you're making a whip commit, then you just add no verify as a flag, and it ignores them. But most of the time I want this. I also want this in CI. And I want to be able to have this both in CI and run clearly, et cetera, et cetera. And like the solution to all those problems is just there with pre-commit hooks. Yeah, so this just runs all of my tests. If I actually deploy, like if I actually use this for something, the CI that I use personally is Nix CI.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's no config and just works.
Just
I mean, right, it's like, I think that might be another one of my biases to like sits. But yeah, no,
I think that's the way to go.
like it just works.
Definitely. That's the same. It's all
like there's a bunch of CIs where, you know, there's a bunch of work that you need to do and you need to find the right command there and set up a config and all this kind of stuff. Whereas with this, like I have Nix CI set up for my GitHub user. Any repo that I put on my GitHub, it runs. Private ones, doesn't matter, it runs. Because I gave them access. So it just works. I don't have to think about it. I make a new repo. I don't have to question, oh, how do I set up CI? I need to remember that. It's too many minutes on GitHub Actions or something.
The concept of scaffolding, right, is quite popular. But I think you're pushing it to sort of a new level, right? Because scaffolding tends to be more more kind of narrow-minded.
And scaffolding is usually to create an example of what the project would look like, rather than to use
a very
basis
specific technology stack that's being scaffolded.
Yes.
Not like
Right.
not exactly confusing.
And that's sort of my point with this, that like the reason that I'm interested in setting up a skeleton is because I've noticed this like this repetitive thing where over the last 3 years or so, anytime I'm involved with a startup project, if I go through enough requirement negotiation to my heart's content, the result is this. Like it just kind of accidentally keeps coming back to the same thing, so that after a while I went, this might be useful for other people. Which is also definitely partly a bias because I don't work at a large company. So if you constantly do startups, then this is more of a thing than if you
building a lot of the projects.
Right. Or the same if you work at a large company that really loves microservices, then you might want to set up like a skeleton for a microservice. Yeah. So you can easily set up a new microservice without having to think about how do I take care of XYZ. It would also be ideal if you could do something like this and be able to kind of generate this code based off of a small config where you say, I want Auth0 and I want Stripe and I want these things.
This is what
which is something that Isaac is working on.
I have so you know Home Manager, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I created Project Manager, which is Home Manager for repos. Mm-hmm. Right. So you just write a Home Manager config, and in fact, it has, for example, Weeder in there. Mm-hmm. So you can and with Nix, of course, you can like pull in configs from other places, like as inputs or whatever. Mm-hmm. So actually, I have the Project Manager project itself that defines tons of modules, just like in Home Manager, for everything for Git and Mercurial and other stuff. GitHub CI, Nix CI, Nix CI, and then things like tools like Weeder, formatters, all that kind of stuff. And so that's all defined in Project Manager. Then I have this repo I call Flaky, which is kind of like where I keep all the common things. So I define my Project Manager config, most of it in Flaky, and then so on an individual project, all I have to say is programs.reader.enable is true, and it will, when I run the Project Manager switch, it'll generate the reader.toml or whatever that from my default. Of course, I can also override like programs.reader. Some other setting in there, like whatever roots, and it'll generate different toml in there. And so so I mean it is public, and I'm not very good at like publicizing, but it is public. I keep needing to share it more widely, people talk or something on it. But yeah, I mean basically it's like so I feel like the stuff that I do is obviously there's a lot of overlap with like Haskell and Nix and all these kind of things, but I tend to write a lot of libraries that are like in different repos used by different projects and things like that. And so the thing that I feel like Project Manager is missing is modules for things like that you've been mentioning, like the database stuff and Selenium and things like that. Because these are the things that I don't I mean, I work sometimes with those things in like client projects and stuff, but not in the things that I'm like applying all this kind of.
So you have it on the Nix side, but not on the Haskell side.
No, I have the Haskell stuff there, but the Haskell stuff is not. It's not stuff like for doing web things and databases. It's all library based, so it's like very much like it has like code formatters and CI stuff and all that kind of stuff in there, generates kinds of things. But anyway, I always feel like it's like, oh, I should really figure out how to like set up modules for doing database stuff in development, databases and for web testing and things like that. But I'm missing all those modules now, but it seems like you have a lot of those things. Like, oh, I really want to like integrate this because and so that was kind of what I was saying earlier about like it's problematic keeping these things in sync. So now I've managed to make my template very small. It's like a tiny flake with this tiny project manager config that mostly just has enables in it and some specializations. And then you run project manager switch, and then it generates all those things. And if you want to change those things, you just override them in your project manager config. And you can regenerate them. And so it's now I still like I change something in the upstream template. Sync my projects, but it's like very small in terms of like the actual conflicts I have to deal with, and because most of it becomes generated. And so anyway, I really want to,
especially with libraries, I imagine keeping everything up to date is more difficult, right? Because like with libraries, you're going to have 100 of them. With startups, there's like 3 that are using this right now.
Exactly. So that's the kind of thing. And now I use Renovate, which like updates things, like runs all the checks, regenerates all the files, like it makes sure like all the files that are committed are like up to date from the generation. That's just like a CI, and that's just like one of the checks provided by Project Manager. So Project Manager generates files, of course, but it also, to use in a flake, Project Manager, that output provides you with a bunch of checks and dev shells and all this stuff. So you can, have this config and be like, oh, okay, well, all these programs that I mentioned in the config will be available in the dev shell. It has checks that check for whatever format you happen to have enabled in your project manager config. So there's a check that checks things are formatted. It runs a check that the generated files are up to date, so like pre-committed kind of stuff, all that kind of thing. And I mean, I don't want to like derail you here, but I'm just like very excited that you're like in the same space and doing things that I feel great to like what I'm doing. So I'm very, very excited about that. But yeah, I think we should talk a little bit at some point. No, I think this is great, and I feel like I really struggle to get people to care about this sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, and one of the reasons, so I think you have a couple good arguments at the beginning, and I felt like one was just kind of this like being able to like show somebody like, well, how do I get started with this thing? Because for me, my argument has often been, oh, I have like hundreds of projects that like all need this stuff, and I can't manually keep change all the CIs to like adjust with like GHC versions or like whatever the things are. I need that to happen automatically and like tell me if something went wrong on repo and I can fix it.
And that's also, of course, one of the disadvantages of wanting this update system, right? Because this doesn't. It's not like once you start using this, if you get this framework and you start building a website with it, and a year from now you go, oh shit, I want to update my GHC version. There's nothing in here that's dependent on my code, right? I'm just giving you the code. Right. So if you want to update your GHE version, you do that by doing the same thing that you would do to update the GHE version if you would have just started with your own flake. Right. Like I'm not importing anything that's like, oh, you need to know something about Program Manager, right? You don't. You don't need to know anything about things that I've done.
Right. And actually, that's one of
which is the benefit I have because it's for like full projects rather than for libraries, right? Because you're never going to have 100 full projects running.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, one of the things with project managers is do like file generation and stuff is that you run it and now you have a large template to like show somebody. Right? And in fact, I've used that for clients where it's like, I'm just going to project manager this, but they don't want to know about project manager any stuff. So once I generate it, like just going to commit those generated files and whatever. And now like, who knows that that's where my template came from.
Right, exactly.
So it disappears. So
but that makes it much easier to sell, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That means you don't have to explain them how you got it. You can just tell them, hey, if you want, in 2 weeks, I can give you a template that saves you 2 weeks of work. And then it turns out it takes you 7 minutes to set it up, which is great.
Yeah, that's very cool.
I don't know if there's anything else that you found
let's look
interesting.
at your directory listing again or whatever and see what other things.
Oh, one of the other things that I've noticed here is that so I do almost exclusively backend when I work for as a consultant. But obviously, if you want to build your own startup, you also need to do DevOps and you also need to do front end. And so I was having a conversation with the guy who helps us out with CSS at some point. And we were talking about how he was frustrated. He was like half as fast as he wanted to be. And what we noticed is that within USO, by default, I have heard since I did this that there's a way around this apparently, but I'm not aware of how to do it. Like by default, the static subsite, if you have one, if you change anything about it, it requires recompilation. So my front-end engineer was just spending half his time waiting for his code to compile. Whereas we made a few small changes where we basically just said, like I just set up some static middleware where I'm saying there's some assets there, environment variable that I define to be, this is the thing that I want to be served statically. And then if anything, where is this? Right, so then I take the static middleware prime thing. Basically, what I'm saying if any request comes in that starts with the phrase static, then remove the phrase static and look up where it is in my static folder. If it doesn't start with static, then just pass it along to my actual server. So I just add this little bit of middleware, and then I add it in my tests as well. So now there's no more question there. So that's one of the things I did in collaboration with Isaac as well. I also have some examples here of golden tests, which are not as common as they should be.
Right.
So yeah, like I said, I mean, if you now want to set up a golden test, everything like the machinery is already there. So adding that is quite easy.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Also have a feedback file here, which I also quite like, which I have to do a lot again and again. Basically, feedback, also a thing by Sid, allows you to define a bunch of loops. There's some configuration options as well, but it just allows you to define a bunch of loops. So I have a loop here, which is named web server, and then I have a description of what it means, so I can say feedback health. And then I just have a script, and it just runs that script within a feedback loop. So it's like a file watcher, essentially. So a way to just wrap any script in a file watcher, so you can do it elegantly and easily. So that's set up. So now if I want to just run this, I just say feedback web server, and it just runs my code and sets up my web server. If I make any changes, it automatically detects it and updates it.
Awesome.
This also works better than like anything stack-based with a file watcher.
Yeah.
Cabal doesn't have one, which to me is all the proof I need that they don't give a shit about their users. But might be a personal note. Yeah. Also, all the deployment stuff is already there. They have everything that I need here is already set up. So I have my web server. Is defined somewhere else, but yeah. So the database backups are already defined in there as well. Obviously, I'm making some assumptions about what my database path looks like. Maybe I'm making it a little bit too big. Yeah, so I define a service and a timer for making database backups. On my web server service, all of that is defined, including the config. The config is automatically coming from options.nix that I showed you earlier from opt-in-conf. So you don't really need to think about anything anymore. This also goes along with, not put this separately. This is the actual stuff from Synapse from my startup. I know that's smart to show this, but yeah, yeah, thanks. I don't know if there's anything else in particular that I should show. So a stripe setup. Things. Yeah, quite happy with this.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I feel like my argument for I have hundreds of things. Everybody else is like, yeah, but I don't have hundreds of things. Okay, fine.
Sure.
But
sure.
I mean, I feel like you
Right.
made some better arguments for this kind of thing. That's what, like,
Right.
It shows what this is where you start from. Is such,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, I used it that way, but for some reason that has not occurred to me as like the argument for it.
Right. I think it's just a matter of trying to figure out if someone doesn't want to go along with it, there's a reason for it. And what is the reason? And I would say very likely the reason people don't want to set up everything properly first and then start building features is because they have the temptation to start building features. And they don't want to bother with database backups of a database that doesn't contain anything reasonable.
Oh, that's totally.
But if you could just give them everything that they need, they're happy to start from there rather than start from scratch.
I mean, no, that's for me, that's totally the way, right? It's because like I'll start a new project because I've got this idea, whatever, I want to implement it right away. But then I'm implementing, I'm just like typing code. First, I'm not even compiling. I just wrote a few hundred lines of Haskell. I'm like, I didn't try to compile anything yet. Like, let's not set up an environment or something. Or it's like, oh, I don't have LSP running for some reason, and and just getting okay, let me get that set up. Let me get this set up, and then being frustrated without them. So it's frustrating the actual feature stuff, but then not wanting to take a break from that to let me get everything configured.
Right.
And getting to this point where it's
to me as well, that's the tension, right?
Yeah.
So an argument against it is that you kind of create the opinionated set of things you deliver, and it's opinionated, right? So it's like experimentation is no longer happening, let me try something else.
Right.
Because this thing is already there, it's convenient, and it's less of a push for you to go and experiment with something else, right?
I would say, if someone introduces me to a new interesting thing that would otherwise make me go experiment, I would set up an experiment. But that's not what this is for, right? This is basically just for, I have a new project that I want to get started on. I have an idea. I want to go build a website. So I want something where immediately I have a website with some of the basic things. Everything is available, and I can just get started.
I'm not saying my arguments
right.
Saying that it's
if someone were to say, hey, but what about, instead of Auth0, what about using this other thing? Then what I would probably do is look at this from Synapse. And Synapse is my startup. If you introduce me to some alternative to Auth0 and I find this interesting, then I would probably experiment with that within Synapse and see whether I like it. And if I do like it, then the once or twice a year that I would come back to my skeleton, I would go update that in my skeleton and go, actually, I think now Auth0 is not the best option anymore. I want to do something else.
I would say if you're you're already doing this to some extent, but if you're putting things in mixed modules, adding a new mixed module and enabling one and disabling the other, and that's what gets generated into your tree or whatever. You don't have to be biased, basically. You can have modules for all these things and then separate modules for GitHub CI or whatever other things.
If you interview at the beginning, configuration file or something, which allows you to define which options, which flavors you
which
want.
sets of tools,
Right.
And as Nix is so good at with its modules and the way the config works, of being if I create this thing, I can make it integrate with all the other things that exist by I have to add these files to the Git ignore or this file to this thing or whatever, and you can do all that in your module and stuff. And so they really kind of feel like they stand alone, but at the same time do a very good job of interacting with other pieces to enable and disable the parts. I make modules that I just use for my home manager configs, just very high level things this machine is going to be a server, so I'm just going to put a module here that takes is it a server or not, and if so, it generates this config, and if not, this one. So then each of my machines just sets that one option. But that module is not useful to anybody other than me. But for me, it works across my machines to say which category of machine does it fall into. Anyway, but yeah.
The
So
other thing I would also say is that this is not causing biases. I am causing biases.
Right.
And I'm just making it easier to work within the tool set that I like. And the fact that I like this tool set is my choice. It's not the part of the fact that it's a skeleton.
Right.
Also, me not having a skeleton doesn't change anything. My last 5 projects, I've used the same thing for, I've used Haskell and Nix and ESOD, and everything was always deployed on an NixOS machine on AWS EC2, and I think I need a good reason to deviate from that. These are my default choices, so I'm making it easier to use my default choices because I usually do.
And
And ripping something out doesn't take much time, right? If you say I don't need to be paid, I don't need Stripe, well then you don't use it.
There is some chance of like calcification, just like, oh, this is my defaults are good, but at the same time, because all the stuff is there, being like, I want to do this one thing differently. At least you can only think about that one thing. You don't think about all the other pieces that this is put in place for you. You're like, I'm going to focus on that aspect of it. Then I definitely have done that too.
And everything but ESOD here is very easy to delete or swap out, right? If you go instead of Auth0, what I want to do is the entire Auth0 integration is basically this, right? Like it's very, very little code. So if you want to swap that out for something else, it's very little work.
Yeah.
If you say instead of ESOD, I want to use servant, and maybe you need a separate. But again, it's kind of against my philosophy. Like I like the idea of going, when you have a new idea, chase the first dollar, and then you can wonder about $10 and $100 and $1,000 from there. I don't want everything to be perfect or to be. I've never had a problem with a website not being performant enough before you were making significant money. That's just, to me, that's a thing to worry about afterwards. Yeah, that was it.
Very excited about that.